I'm Aaron David Miller, and this is Carnegie Connects. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this wonderful world of ours. I hope you're safe and, above all, healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie, Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a set of virtual discussions, at least for now, about issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, I'm especially pleased to welcome back to Carnegie Connects Rob Malley, a friend, a former colleague, and now the Biden administration's special envoy for Iran. Rob, first, let me welcome you back. It's great to see you. And one day, hopefully, we'll be able to do something like this actually in person. I guess I'd start off by framing, at least my view. A great deal has changed since we spoke last. But one thing seems to remain the same, and that is there really are no good or easy options for the Biden administration or for the United States, frankly, with respect to Iran. U.S. policy is kind of betwixt and between. Protesters want regime change, and the administration is unwilling, perhaps it's a good idea, maybe not, to basically articulate that strategy. The JCPOA is seemingly increasingly less viable, although how you restrain Iran's nuclear capacity without it, some sort of diplomatic arrangement is unclear. And we may well be confronting a post-JCPOA world. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that later. And finally, Iran is now a informal combatant in perhaps the greatest foreign policy challenge that the administration, or in many respects, the international system has faced since the end of World War II, Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. There's much to discuss, but I first want to ask you how you're holding up. The Iran nuclear negotiations are in abeyance. We'll return to those in a bit. And the focus has shifted to what's happening on the streets in Iran. You've come under a great deal of criticism, largely from the Iranian diaspora, about your role, including calls for you to resign. And I just wonder, first, how are you handling all of this? And is there anything you would like to say or want to say to your critics?
So first, Aaron, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with you, and particularly in this forum. And it's a great opportunity at this time to try to clarify some things and to get into an in-depth discussion, as I'm sure we will in the course of the next 45 minutes or so. So listen, you raised the attacks. Yes, there's a lot of emotion, a lot of passion about what's going on in Iran, and it's legitimate. It's very legitimate. So many in the Iranian American community have suffered for so much at the hands of this regime. They are not here by choice. A number of them, they would prefer to be back home, but they can't because of the nature of the regime and because of the violence that it has been exercising against its own people. And what they're seeing today at this moment, which is this popular movement, grassroots popular movement, which is so awe-inspiring in terms of its courage, its determination, its persistence. And on the other hand, the gut-wrenching violence, brutality of a regime that's going after people on the street, particularly women and girls, young girls who are at the forefront of this movement. So I get it. I understand that everything we do, everything we say is going to be scrutinized, and people are going to feel very strongly, and critics are going to feel very strongly about what we do, what the policy of this administration is, and we have to take that into account. Now, the particular issue over which people were most upset at me in the last couple of weeks was a tweet that I put out in which I characterized the aspirations and the demands of the people of this popular movement in Iran. And it was a mistake. And I owned up to the mistake. It's not something that I should do, particularly because it was viewed as diminishing the demands of the protesters. And so what I said and what I'll say again today, it's not up to us. It's certainly not up to me to characterize what the people on the streets of Iran, particularly the women who are demonstrating what they want. They're doing a very good job themselves expressing their demands and their aspirations. What we as the US government have to do, what the Biden administration has to do and has been doing, is supporting the fundamental rights of Iranians and taking action, which I'm sure we'll be getting into, to make sure that the regime is held to account and that Iranians can continue to express themselves and to communicate with the outside world. So that's what we need to do. And I accept, we're in a country where there should be legitimate debate and strong debate. I would draw a line, and just my last comment on this, and this doesn't have anything to do with me, but there have been some attacks against Iranian Americans who may not, there's a diversity of views, and some of these attacks, particularly against women, have been borderline threats, harassment, sometimes in a very sexualized way against women. And that's wrong, and that's always wrong. It's particularly wrong today when the movement in Iran is led by women, when the slogan is women, life, freedom, to see attacks against women, members of the Iranian American community in particular, in such a violent way and a harassing way. That should stop. That's not the best way to defend the cause of the Iranian people.
Right, Rob, thank you for that. I also want to point out, I feel a certain kinship here. We worked the Arab-Israeli issue for a number of years. I worked it for a good deal longer, and we were attacked and hammered from all sides. It's a thankless task. It's worth pointing out, however, that the notion that you are single-handedly responsible for shaping, formulating, and executing U.S. policy toward Iran is a fundamental misunderstanding of the way our system works. And I think your critics may have legitimate grounds based on the tweet, but they should internalize that issue, because singling you out for the kind of ad hominem to which you've been exposed is wrong. And it makes you look bad and frankly, U.S. policy as well. Let's continue to talk a little bit about your critics. The broad critique of the Biden administration's policy is that the administration has been far too focused, obsessed, tethered to an agreement which many see as not only flawed, but fundamentally ill-equipped to deal with the realities of Iran's nuclear program. And that the protests on the streets, Vladimir Putin's receiving Iranian drones, advisors, maybe even surface missiles, require a broader look for the United States in our Iran policy. Is that a fair critique? If yes or no, could you lay out for us, in the broadest sense, what the administration's policy is toward all of these elements?
So, Aaron, you're right. That has been one of the criticisms. And, I think part of it is just the prism through which our policy has been presented. It has focused heavily on the talks in Vienna, on the revival of NATO, the nuclear deal. But that is only one piece of a much broader policy, which perhaps we have not, or the media has not presented as fully. And so I want to take this opportunity to present it, because it's been an all-of-government policy led by the president when he first appointed me, laying out what he wanted our strategy towards Iran to be. So if I can take a few minutes to express it. Number one was to try to reconstitute an alliance, particularly with our close allies, our European allies, on Iran policy. During the years of the Trump administration, particularly after President Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal in 2018, European countries, our closest allies, spent about as much time criticizing U.S. policy on Iran than they did criticizing Iran itself. That was not good for us. Now, guess what? We now are about 2 years in. We in Europe are completely on the same page when it comes to reacting to Iran's nuclear program, reacting to Iran's policy in Ukraine, Iran's support for Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and standing together, shoulder to shoulder, in expressing support for the Iranian people at this time when they are confronting the violence of their regime. So that was critical, and that's what we've done for the last 18 plus months. And I think we really have succeeded in restitching what is so crucial if we want to have a common front to push back against Iran's destabilizing activities, human rights violations, or nuclear program. Number two, and you mentioned it, it is to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And that this is not something that we're going to walk away from. We believe, and the president made that clear commitment, he would not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. We are using many tools to get that. The preferred tool, and that's not just our view, I think it's the view including of people who have very different ways of addressing Iran's nuclear program, including the Israeli government. They all admit, they all say there is no long-term sustainable solution other than a diplomatic one. So there are other responses to Iran's nuclear program, which I'll get into, but diplomacy is the preferred way. It's the preferred way to try to resolve it. And that's why, yes, without apologies, we've been engaged in an effort to try to defend US national security interests, because an Iran with a nuclear weapon would make the entire world more unsafe and US security more unsafe. And so that's why we've been focused on it, among many other things. Now, there are other tools, sanctions, pressure, and yes, as the president has said, if all other means fail as a last resort, he would keep the military option very clearly on the table if that's what it would take to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. So that's number two. Number three is pushing back against Iran's destabilizing activities in the region, its proliferation of drones, ballistic missiles, its interference in other countries, its attacks against some of its neighbors. And we have, together with our partners and allies and all the agencies in our government, tried to make an effort to combat and counter those activities, whether it's through sanctions, through interdictions, through hardening the defenses of our allies and our own defenses, and finding other ways to push back against Iran's destabilizing activities. We hadn't predicted that it would take place, including that Iran would expand that destabilizing effort to Europe, and we'll get to that, I'm sure, in this conversation, but we're also focused on that, and that's a very strong pillar of our policy on which we've made real advances. Number four, and the president again made this clear, not just about Iran, but about our global policy, which is to put human rights and the defense of human rights back at the center of our foreign policy. We've done that across the globe. We're doing that, and we have done that when it comes to Iran. I think you're seeing that today in every step we've taken and everything that we've said since the outbreak of the protests in Iran. But that goes back earlier in terms of our denunciation of Iran's human rights violations and trying to get other countries around the globe to unite in defense of Iranian people's basic human rights. Again, I'm sure we'll talk more about what steps we're taking now, particularly at this moment, to make sure that we could stay true to that commitment, which, as I said, is a global commitment. We do our best to be consistent. It is not a perfect science, but in the case of Iran, I think we've been very strong in trying to push for respect for the Iranian people's human rights. And last but not least is to try to get and to make sure that we get the 3 remaining hostages in Iran back home and reunited with their families as soon as possible. That's been a priority of the administration, President Biden, Secretary Blinken, the National Security Advisor, and of course, my team and myself to get them home. Imad Shargi, Siamak Namazi, Murad Tabaz, all 3 deserve to be home. They should never have been imprisoned. It's an outrageous practice that the Iranian government has had, which is to use these dual nationals as pawns. They need to be home, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that day comes as soon as possible.
Yeah.
But that's our policy. It's not a nuclear policy. It's a policy that tries to bring all elements of U.S. power, of U.S. diplomacy to bear to achieve those objectives.
It's complicated. It's complicated. And usually the choices available to the president on complicated foreign policy issues aren't between good and better, but between bad and worse. You think strategically, and I before we get to the issue of the demonstrations, the protests, the extraordinary events that are happening in Iran, I want to ask you this question. The JCPOA initially was designed as a sort of transactional, not transformational agreement. It was a transactional effort, an arms control agreement, if you will, to constrain Iran's nuclear program, and presumably to preempt an Israeli strike and to make an American strike, which 4 American presidents have declared would occur, a military option, in order to prevent Iran from obtaining a weapon. But it remains, because of the nature of the regime, in large part, and their need to turn the United States as an adversary into a element of regime mobilization and Iranian nationalism. The whole approach toward Iran's nuclear program very much remains transactional. Even adherence to the JCPOA would not guarantee that after a discrete period of time, the Iranians could not, if they chose to, return to enrichment and even the production of a nuclear weapon. does that reality, or how does that reality influence and affect and shape the whole notion of American policy toward Iran with respect to the nuclear issue?
So, Aaron, I'll say this. First, we make no apology for having tried and still trying to do everything we can to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. Again, a preference for diplomacy, if that can work, with tools of pressure, sanctions in particular, but also keeping very much all options on the table in case diplomacy were to fail. So I'm sure we'll get back to that in particular. But I do want to address one of the points that I think some of our critics have made, which is that because we're still trying, or we have been trying to pursue a nuclear deal, we've left other elements of our policy on the shelf. That's not true. It's simply not true. That we have not self-deterred because of a pursuit of a diplomatic agreement. I think you've seen in the actions of the Biden administration, including, and when I mentioned countering Iran's destabilizing activity, I should have mentioned first and foremost the president's decision to use force on at least 2 occasions against Iranian-affiliated militia in Syria, which were going after U.S. troops. So defending U.S. interests, defending the stability of the region, that takes place regardless of whether the nuclear negotiations are succeeding, not succeeding, regardless of whether there's a JCPOA or not. All of the other elements of our policy, we will conduct and we have conducted regardless of the fate of the nuclear deal. So I want to make that clear. When people say, why don't you walk away from the negotiations? It would give you more ability to do other things. We've been doing those other things. We haven't waited to see what happens to the nuclear deal. By the way, any more than Iran has waited. Iran has continued its destabilizing activities. Iran has continued its support for violent groups and terrorist groups across the region. Iran has continued to develop its ballistic missiles and to repress its people and to target and to plot against Americans, by the way, which is another of their completely unacceptable forms of behavior. And if they can do that, even as they claim they're trying to negotiate a nuclear deal, we can do the same. We can take action against those destabilizing activities. We can mobilize countries around the globe. We could counter Iran's activities, even as we are seeking to reach a diplomatic solution on the nuclear front. But again, we'll come to that because there's been no movement on the negotiations now for 2 months.
Right. Well, we can return to the issue. It's troubling, and I'm not sure you or anyone else has an answer, which is how to deal with the strategic reality that even with or without the JCPOA, once sunsets expire, unless they were renewed or a follow-on agreement negotiated, you still face the reality of Iran as a nuclear threshold state. I don't say this is criticism. I think this is a serious strategic challenge for any administration, and we don't have an answer to it, I suspect. But I want to talk to you about the protests and the demonstrations and get a sense from you on what U.S. policy is. It's really hard to analyze, I think you'd agree, regarding what's happening in the streets. You have an extraordinary political movement, leaderless perhaps for now, with seemingly a lot of different demands, but one overriding demand, and that is for a new regime. And they're willing, in extraordinary fashion, to risk batons and bullets in order to achieve it. It's hard to know where we are in this process. Are we at the end of the beginning of the end? Are we somewhere in between? Robin Wright reminded me the other day that the Iranian Revolution took 14 months. And even the Green Revolution began in June of 2009 and didn't conclude until February of 2010. So I guess that's my question to you. The administration seems to be navigating a line between calling for regime change on one hand and finding ways credibly to support the Iranians in the streets on the other. So if you had to characterize U.S. policy toward this, I'm not sure how to characterize it, unrest demonstrations, extraordinary efforts on the part of, led by women in order to change the regime, how would you identify the elements of U.S. policy toward what's happening in Iran internal?
So Aaron, I've alluded to it before. We're not going to characterize the aspirations of the Iranian people as a whole. They can do, and they have done, a pretty good job themselves. And the future of this popular movement will be decided by the Iranian people, not by the United States, not by any outsider. We are decided in Iran by Iranians. Now, what can we do? What can we do as the U.S.? And what have we done? I'd say it's really been four things. First, to make clear our support for the fundamental rights of the Iranian people. Again, as I said, that's a global approach that we have to human rights, but it's one that we're now focused very much on in the case of Iran, which is to support the fundamental rights of the Iranian people. That's number one, and we've done that vocally. We've done that from day one. I think you've heard from the president, you heard from the Secretary of State, you heard from the National Security Advisor, all the senior officials in the administration voicing their support for the fundamental rights of the Iranian people. That's number one. Number two is to try to make sure that this is a multilateral international effort, an international point of view. It's not an American point of view. You're seeing countries in the global south, like Chile, who are saying the same thing about the support for the fundamental rights of the Iranian people and the condemnation of the regime violence against them. And that's number three, which is to make sure that the world knows and sees the actions of this Iranian regime, use of violence against peaceful protesters, and the brutality that the protesters have suffered. And we are going to, through our sanctions, through putting a spotlight on what's happening in Iran, through actions in multilateral fora, whether it's at the United Nations, whether at the Human Rights Commission, whether it's in other places like the Online Freedom Coalition, there are ways in which we are going to make sure that people are watching and know what the Iranian regime is doing, and they're held accountable. And so that's the other element of our policy. And then finally, and just as importantly, is to make sure that our sanctions, the sanctions that we have imposed on Iran historically over decades, do not interfere with the ability of the Iranian people to communicate with each other or with the outside world, so that, again, the outside world could see what's happening, and so the Iranian people could hear of the support that they're getting from countries across the globe. So that's been the steps that we've taken to make sure that the restrictions on the internet access that the Iranian regime is trying to impose are not compounded by our policy, but to the contrary, that we're able to do what we can to take away those obstacles and make sure that there's a free flow of information as possible among Iranians and between Iran and the outside world. So that's our policy. It's a policy of support for basic human rights. It's a policy of condemnation of violence and repression against those who are demonstrating for those basic fundamental human rights. And it's a policy of trying to make sure that those who are responsible for that violence are held accountable. And you'll see that we have now imposed a series of sanctions against perpetrators of human rights violations in Iran, not just at the very top. That's what we always do, we typically do, but also mid-level officials who may have thought that they could escape, the limelight, that they could hide behind the anonymity of the fact that nobody knows who they are outside of Iran to continue with their misdeeds. But no, we've identified them. We've done our work so that they can be sanctioned as well. They could be named and shamed, and they know that the world is watching. They know that we know what they're doing to the Iranian people. So that's the policy. It's one of supporting the rights of the Iranian people and making sure that those officials who are responsible for blatant human rights violations are called to account.
There are many, obviously, Rob, who think we can do more. Any number of ideas have been tossed out and generated. Increasing the use of cyber against the regime, funneling money to workers so that they can continue to strike, throwing Iran off the U.S. Commission on the Status of Women, refocusing Voice of America 24/7, or at least the Iranian broadcasts on what's happening in Iran, doing more on the issue of tracking and reporting on crimes against humanity. I just wonder, this is unique, idiosyncratic, what's happening in Iran, but we've been through this in a way with respect to U.S. policy through the Arab Spring, where in fact we tried many rather potentially transformative uses of American power to deal with the internal realities in a handful of countries. And Phil Gordon, a friend and colleague of yours, came up with this sort of dictum. In Iraq, we invaded the country. which proved to be clearly incredibly fraught. In Libya, we applied military pressure to facilitate regime change, and that clearly didn't work out. In Syria, we didn't stand on the sidelines, but we spent an enormous amount of money trying to funnel resources to Sunni opposition, and yet there wasn't much success there as well. I mean, I just wonder, from a broad perspective, whether or not, when it comes to crises like these, whether or not, by definition, the American role is going to be very limited, much to the dismay of those who want us to do more. Is that a fair analysis of how we're going to approach events in other countries over which we have little control, particularly when they involve matters of internal politics?
So, Aaron, you and I have spent countless hours discussing the scope and limits of U.S. influence, U.S. power. I don't think here's the place to discuss lessons learned from the Arab uprisings. But I will say this, and I spent some time certainly over the last days, but in talking to members of the Iranian American community to hear their ideas. A number of the things that you've mentioned, I won't go through them one by one, but a number of them we had been considering for weeks and we're working on. So it's not because you haven't seen them yet that they won't happen. But I do want to come back to the fundamental point I made earlier. I think the U.S. role can be very ambitious. I think it also has to be very realistic. I mean, there's only so much that we can do and that we should do because we are not the center stage of what's happening in Iran. It is a movement led by Iranians. It's a grassroots popular movement. They will determine, and the Iranian people will determine their future. What we can do, and which we should do consistently, if we could throughout the world, which is be very coherent in terms of the values that we promote, what we're trying to support in terms of fundamental universal human rights, and the condemnation that we should always level against those who are repressing peaceful protesters or those who are ignoring and denying their people these fundamental rights. That we can do, and we can be very effective at doing it. I've told you already what we've already done. We're going to continue. You'll see more sanctions. You're going to see more efforts to try to make sure that the internet is as unencumbered as possible. You'll see more steps in international fora, including some that you mentioned, to try to show the world and show Iran that we're holding their regime to account, together with a broad coalition, a very broad coalition, and not just of Western countries. Because this is not a matter of the West against Iran. You're seeing, again, countries in the global South, countries that have, that haven't done this so much in the past, that are saying what's happening in Iran is not acceptable. So I think you'll see a lot that we can do, but at the end of the day, what happens in Iran will be decided and determined by the Iranian people, and that's the way it should be.
Right. I mean, there is a danger, it would seem to me, in creating the reality that American fingerprints are all over these demonstrations. You saw the report, I think, in The Guardian, that two female journalists who were instrumental in reporting on the death of Mahsa Amini have been labeled as CIA agents. Now, the Iranians are going to do this regardless, frankly, it would seem to me, of what we do or don't do. But is this at least some indication of the dangers and risks of the United States seeming to try to micromanage?
So a few points. I mean, it's a good question you raise. A few points. First, you're right that the Iranian regime will do everything to paint this as a U.S.-inspired or an Israeli-inspired movement. Now, that's absurd on its face. There's nothing that the United States could do that would convince 15-year-old girls to challenge the authorities at great risk to their lives and security. Nothing that we could do that would convince Iranian women and others to come out into the streets in the face of, as I said, great peril to their own lives. That kind of anger, that kind of passion can only have been triggered by the policies of the regime itself. So they could point the finger at us, they could point the finger at Israel. They should look in the mirror because it's their policies that have generated that kind of anger and that kind of movement. So we could dismiss it for what it is. And by the way, this is the The same officials who are claiming that we're behind it are the officials that said that Mahsa Amini died of natural causes, the same who are denying in the face of mounting and irrefutable evidence to the contrary that they have transferred drones to Russia. So this is not, it's not new that they would make things up. We don't want to give them, easy-made excuses. As I said, we've been very clear in terms of our policy, that our policy is not one of interfering to try to foment regime change. It's one of supporting the basic rights of the Iranian people. And we're not going to apologize for it because we're going to continue doing it. And you're right, we have to expect the Iranian regime to try to paint and those protesters as being lackeys of the US and of Israel. I think the Iranian people see right through that. I don't think this is a playbook that's going to work. We know of others who have tried to use it in the Middle East, and it doesn't work because when anger is being generated, this level of fury is being generated by the policies of the regime. You cannot convince anyone that it's being in any way micromanaged by the US.
Let's turn to another intriguing feature, worrisome feature of the current situation, and that is the decision by the Iranian regime to supply drones varying ranges and precision, advisors, presumably IRGC, to Crimea to train, operate, and maybe reports, I don't know how reliable they are, of surface-to-surface missiles. Ukraine has produced very strange bedfellows. There's an enormous amount of hedging that goes on with respect to not fully siding with the U.S. You have an intriguing set of relationships here. The Saudis have an interest in cooperating with Russia on hydrocarbons. Iran is supplying drones and advisors, perhaps surface missiles, and is becoming what is tantamount to a direct participant in Putin's war against Ukraine. We can leave the Saudis out of this for now, maybe another Carnegie next discussion. But what do you make of Iran's calculation in supplying these weapons to Russia? And second, what is the administration doing about it?
So, let's first say what we know. What are the facts? We know that Iran has been transferring deadly drones to Russia. We know that, and it's been, there's no controversy anymore. It's incontrovertible because the evidence is on the ground. Ukrainians have recovered those drones, and they are Iranian-made drones. So we know that. We know that Iran has been training Russian operators in usage of those drones. We know that those drones have been used to target civilians and civilian infrastructure. And we know that Iran, in the face of all of this evidence, keeps lying and denying that that's happening, which shows that they are embarrassed, that they know that this is something that is isolating them internationally, and probably also makes their lives harder at home because, Iranian people who are protesting for their own fundamental rights, and they see what Iran is doing, which is sending the deadly drones to so they're not just killing their own people, they're now also helping Russia kill innocent Ukrainian civilians. So that is something that Iran, the Iranian regime has made a very bad bet in this respect. Why they made it, I'll leave it up to them to explain, but it's really a bad bet. It's a losing bet, and it's one that's going to isolate them internationally, as it has. And I think you're seeing calls from across the globe saying this is simply outrageous that Iran would be using those deadly drones, which they've already used to ill effect in the region. Now they're using it in a European theater. I think that's something that for a country that has claimed that, it stands strongly in favor of the sovereignty of other countries, itself had been attacked by Iraq, for it to participate in a war of aggression by Russia against the sovereign state of Ukraine. That's something that I don't know how many people had imagined that we'd see that day, but it must stop. And you're asking what we're doing about it. So obviously we're putting a very strong spotlight on it. If Iran thought that it could do that and hide it, well, they failed. They failed. And they'll continue to fail if these reports about transferring missiles bear out. Then they will fail in hiding that as well, and sanctioning anyone who is in any way, even tangentially related to those transfers, whether they are Iranian, Russian, or a third party. We will find them and we will sanction them, and we'll find other ways to try to make sure that we could put an end to this deadly transfer But as you say, I mean, it's something you're now seeing, the Europeans, of course, are extremely mobilized by this against Iran, and they've sanctioned Iran as well because it's something that is in their backyard. It's for Iran to think that it can get away with this and not fundamentally compromise its relations with countries across the globe showed real ineptitude.
Yeah, I'm not going to press you on what else we may be doing to interdict shipments or the use of cyber in order to affect that relationship. But we've weaponized intelligence in the run-up to the Ukraine war. And I think your point that you made, shedding a spotlight constantly and reminded the Iranian public about what the regime is doing, not just with respect to sending drones to Russia, but their activities throughout the region, particularly in Syria, is a useful way, it seems to me, to name and shame and to demonstrate we have this capacity and that we're able actually to use it. Let me turn now, I guess, to what I don't think we need a prolonged discussion on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, but I do want to ask you a couple things on the state and the fate of the JCPOA. First of all, can you, and I know this may be annoying and somewhat tedious, but Rob, can you just briefly summarize for us the state of play in the negotiations, which are now in abeyance? Where were they? And how close were they really to finishing?
So listen, I want to just make a few points because it has been an issue that has generated legitimate criticism, legitimate concerns. Number one, as I said, President Biden said during the campaign and since he's been in office that we believe that he is committed to preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And that diplomacy is the best way to do that. And so we will pursue it without apology. And nobody has come up with a better answer at this point than diplomacy as a long-term sustainable answer to Iran's efforts, past efforts, and any future efforts to acquire a nuclear weapon. And so that is number one. At the same time, as I said, we will use other tools and, in last resort, a military option if necessary to stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. So what we had done since the early days of the administration was see whether a diplomatic path was available. And we worked hand in glove with our European partners to test that proposition. And several times we came very close. And each time we came close, Iran came up with one new extraneous demand that derailed the talks. And the latest episode I think you're referring to was in August, when we do believe that we were very close. The Europeans certainly believed we were close. The European Union had put a plan on a proposal on the table that everyone else had agreed to. And Iran at the last minute, once again, came back with a demand which was extraneous to the JCPOA and which none of the other participants, I believe, if you question them privately, including the Russians and the Chinese, would have said was a legitimate demand to close these negotiations. So that's where we were late August, early September, and there has been no movement since then. So when you say it's in abeyance, it's really not our focus right now. It's not on our agenda because nothing has changed. So we're not going to focus on something that is inert when other things are happening. There are these protests in Iran, which are as significant as we were describing earlier. And there is this new decision by Iran to participate in a war in Europe by transferring drones to Russia. So that's what we're focused on because nothing's happening on the nuclear deal. And so we're not going to waste our time on it if nothing's going to happen. We're going to spend our time where we can be useful. That doesn't mean that we have given up on diplomacy. It doesn't mean that we don't believe that diplomacy is the best way to address this. But if Iran has taken the position it's taken, we're not going to spend time focused on that. We're going to continue to use our sanctions and other pressure tools to make sure that Iran can't acquire a nuclear weapon, and we're going to focus on areas where we can be effective at this time.
Yeah, the last comment from Secretary Blinken, I think, was Saturday to Canadian broadcast. He said, quote, "There's no forward movement. The Iranians continue to try to inject extraneous, unrelated issues into the conversation." The interviewer may have made an editorial comment impressing the secretary to basically say that it's dead. Now, he hasn't done that. The president hasn't done it. Some argue that it's time for the administration to fold up the tent on this issue. And I can see the argument that you don't want to be providing sanctions relief, clearly, although that's not really on the table right now and may not be for the foreseeable future. Pulling the plug might also demonstrate to the protesters that we stand with them and we're not going to have any dealings with the regime. You still, though, in the end, face the ultimate challenge is what to do about an unrestrained, unconstrained Iranian nuclear program. I'm imagining, you don't have to respond, that one of the reasons that we don't want to fold up the tent and say it's over is because of that fact. There's no need to basically do that right now, no compelling need. But it just seems to me, and again, you can respond if you want, that months from now, if in fact the Iranians manage to figure out how to deal with these demonstrations, but you've got hundreds, if not more, Iranians killed and injured, it's going to be extremely difficult for any administration to return to an agreement. The domestic political constraints alone would be extremely difficult to overcome. The regime having killed so many of its own citizens, continue to oppress and oppress them. So we're really in a jam and in a bind, I think, on this. My own personal view is that this was a flawed but highly functional agreement. I don't see any alternative options, frankly, toward constraining Iran's nuclear program, and we have an interest in doing so. So I don't know how you can reconcile all of this. It's still useful, the JCPOA, perhaps, and you don't want to basically say it's over. Is there anything?
Aaron, let me try to, and I'll repeat some of the things I've already said. I mean, number one, but I do think it's critical to understand, we lived the alternative that the Trump administration, they tried to say, let's get out of the deal. Let's just use pressure to see whether we can make Iran succumb to our pressure and come back to the table and get a better nuclear deal. It didn't work. I mean, several years on, we saw Iran with a galloping nuclear program. That experiment, the experiment of the Trump administration, failed. And we are facing today the reality, as you said, where Iran is only a few weeks away from having enough highly enriched uranium for a bomb. So, we tried that. It was a real life experiment and it failed. We believe, as I said, that diplomacy, and without apology, diplomacy is going to be necessary at some point to address this issue if we can. Without taking other options off the table if diplomacy fails. So I think that's, and you referred to what Secretary Blinken said. People could go see what he said. I can't say it any better than he did in terms of our approach to Iran's nuclear program. So yes, we're committed to preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. Yes, we believe diplomacy is the best way of doing it. And yes, we tried the alternative. Now, all that being said, I understand when people say, why don't you walk away? But they may be under the misimpression that the fact that there are talks that are in abeyance and are not dead, that somehow it's constraining our policy options on other fronts. It is not. There is nothing now that we are not doing because we are thinking of the potential of a potential nuclear deal in the future. We are taking the actions that I described in terms of the protests in Iran. We're taking the actions that I described in terms of Iran's destabilizing activities in the region, in terms of Iran's support for Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. All of that we are doing, regardless of what happens in terms of the nuclear negotiations. So I think people have to understand that we're not tying our hands because of this hope that someday maybe there'll be a deal. No, we are taking action. We're not waiting. We're taking the action that we think is consistent and necessary to promote our values and our national security interests. We do believe that preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon is fundamental to those national security interests, and we will continue to see what we can do to achieve that goal. But in the meantime, we are not deterring ourselves from taking the other steps that we think are necessary to advance our interests, our values, and our goals.
You're arguing basically that the administration behaving as if there were no JCPOA. And
No, I'm saying, no, Aaron, I'm saying, no, don't put words in my mouth. I'm saying, it doesn't matter what happens on the nuclear negotiations, whether that we get a deal, we don't get a deal, put that aside because it's not relevant today. But I'm saying, regardless, throughout, from the time that President Biden took office to this day, we have taken steps on these other fronts, regardless of what was happening on the nuclear front. So whether it's in terms of our sanctions, whether it's in terms of our support for our partners and allies, whether it's in terms of our condemnation of Iran's actions, we are acting based on what we consider to be our national security interests and our values on all those fronts, regardless of what's happening on the JCPOA. And that was true from day one, and it's definitely true today at a time when those talks have been very much stalled.
I guess I'd conclude with where I started. And first of all, I want to thank you so much, Rob, for sharing your thoughts. It's a thankless task, and I really do hope that you continue to do it. The options are not great. I don't believe in transformations. In essence, this was always about transactions, hopefully smart transactions to restrain and constrain Iran's nuclear program. How you manage a oppressive regime that has demonstrated an uncanny ability to survive and repress its own public is inextricably linked to this, I think, and the U.S.-Iranian relationship or non-relationship, but it's almost impossible to imagine as things play out where we're going to be 4, 5, 6 months from now. But again, Rob, let me thank you so much for doing this. And to our Carnegie Connects viewers and listeners, November 9th, the day after the midterms, we'll be having a special Carnegie Connects with Essie Cupp and Norman Ornstein analyzing the results of the midterm elections. So stay tuned. And as I want to say, think positive, but definitely test negative.
Thank you, Aaron.
Rob, thanks again.